Well, economics is a very general subject, and of course I'm quite happy to be part of the general mainstream of economics as I see it. So there is nothing terribly unusual about my approach to economics. I think the big influence in my thinking in economics has been Adam Smith, and it may be useful for me to discuss what I see as Smith's economics as being. So there is on one side the importance of people, human beings, what motivates them, why do they do what they do, how they interact with each other. And there are importance of institutions. We live in a world in which there are various institutions of the state as well as of the market economy, and it's the combination that produces economic results that we actually see. And in case of Smith, he, as a professor of philosophy at Glasgow, he came to the subject after doing his first book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was a book on morality and ethics and also good governance. And his economics book, The Wealth of Nations, followed that. So there is need for an understanding of the ethical demands on economics, and there's a need for understanding the science of economics as to what makes what happen, and not let ethics cloud that. At the same time, without understanding why are we asking this question, what makes them interesting questions, without understanding that, I don't think we can get very good economics. So I think this concern that putting ethics in its place, an important place, but not confusing it with the role of science in economics, is very important. The importance of institutions as well as of people are great. And I think these things together constitute a certain approach to economics that Adam Smith put forward, and I'm quite comfortable with that. So if people sometimes say, I'm different from others, well, I would say that primarily because they're different from Adam Smith's tradition. And I would see myself as being very much in that tradition.
Adam Smith is considered the father of classical political economy. His major work, The Wealth of Nations, was considered a fundamental reference for the economists of the 18th and 19th centuries. The principal idea of Smith, who revolutionized modern thought on economy, is to bring together the interests of the individual with the wealth of the states. The source of this wealth is the work of individuals, which is brought forward not from benevolence, but impulses of an essentially selfish nature. A baker bakes bread, a brewer beer, a butcher meat, not to give away to others, but to make a profit. And this is not considered something evil to society, but a benefit, because by pursuing one's own interest, everyone will contribute to a collective well-being. To achieve this positive goal, however, an economic activity must take place in a free competitive market, a market that is able to regulate itself thanks to the rules of supply and demand. The popular image is that of an invisible hand, which spontaneously produces an equilibrium in prices, wages, investments and savings. Smith has transformed the way we see the economy of the West for all the centuries to come. But he has also overturned the social hierarchy of his day, removing supremacy from the holders of annuities and landowners and passing it along to the producers of goods, the pioneers of innovation, and the creators of well-being for the community.
Well, social choice theory is a very interesting subject for me. Its origin goes back to 18th century French mathematicians, particularly Marquis de Condorcet, Volta, and a few others, mostly active in the French Academy of Sciences at that time. They were very concerned with the question of how to aggregate different people's ideas, preferences, values into an overall assessment. On one side, they were concerned with elections, particularly to the French Academy of Sciences, but also general in a country. So it connects with the theory of democracy. But it also connects with how to view how a society consisting of many people, how is society doing? And in looking at that, you have to put together the interests of many people who are all present in the society, and you can't take any of them to be the sole determinant of what's good and bad for the society. So you have to see how their lives are going, income, unemployment, their substantive freedoms. Can they do what they want? Do they have the means to buy the things that they need? To what extent are they avoiding poverty? To what extent they are in a position to have the freedom of choice that they would like to have? All these concerns come into the issues connected with the judgment of what we call welfare economics. Now, Condorcet actually was not only a mathematician, he was also a good social thinker. And in addition to do his mathematical work, he also wrote a series of articles and, in fact, books, which are published together and in the form of essays. And he was actually a great admirer of Adam Smith. In fact, he translated one of Smith's books to French, and his wife translated part of another of Smith's books into French. So they were very much in the same tradition. So in many ways, they have the same concern. Society consists of many people. You have to see how things are going for the society and how you would arrive at it by putting together the interests of different people. Now, that particular clue that was present in the writings of Condorcet and among the French 18th century mathematicians, that was revived by Kenneth Arrow in the 20th century. His seminal article was in 1950. His book, Social Choice and Individual Values, came out in 1951. I remember reading it as an undergraduate in Calcutta in 1951. I just moved from my school to being in Calcutta at Presidency College. One of my classmates, Shekumar Chakravarti, who had just seen the new book that has come out, and he used to go and borrow books from the bookshop. We didn't have very much money, but the bookseller was quite kind to us. He would let us borrow a book as long as we didn't dirty it. So he would cover it up with a newspaper cover. And he brought it one day, I think it must have been early January, February of 1952, shortly after Ken Arrow's book had come out. And he told me, Amartya, this is a book that will interest you very much. He was concerned with welfare economics, Kenneth Arrow was, as to how we can go beyond just judging simple things like if everyone's life improves, then society is better off. But you have to judge a bit more than that. And in that context, he ran into an impossibility theorem, which actually turns out to be a generalization of what Condorcet had played around with already. Condorcet had first considered what is now called the voting paradox, whereby if there are three people, one prefers A to B to C, another prefers B to C to A, and the third prefers C to A to B, then in a majority vote, A will defeat B, B will defeat C, but then again C will defeat A, thereby producing a complete circle. And he thought that that paradox meant that there is a real problem in deciding how to do. Now Condorcet went off in one direction as to how this kind of problem can be solved in much more public discussion, much more. He was a great champion of education, Marquis de Condorcet was, particularly women's education. I'm right in thinking that Condorcet was probably the first person to theorize the importance of women's education and draw the connection which all demographers draw today, namely female education is the way that fertility rates will come down, because women will reason and exercise their voice, their choice, in not having constantly children to bear and rear. Kenneth Arrow did not go so much in the direction of conversation between each other. That tradition went to James Buchanan in public choice theory, who pursued that connection very much. But Kenneth Arrow went much more into the mathematics of how you could aggregate people's preferences. And he kept on getting more and more difficult problems, so that when he published his impossibility theorem, which is the star piece in that 1951 book, he showed that with very simple assumptions, like one assumption, if everyone prefers X to Y, society is better off than Y. If you want to judge between X and Y, you look at people's preferences over X and Y and not other irrelevant alternatives. So these were very simple conditions. And then on top of that, if you want a kind of ordering, proper X better than Y, Y better than Z, should mean that X is better than Z, rather than Z beating X. So this proved to be impossible. These conditions couldn't be put together. And that generated a challenge. I encountered the challenge in 1951. Later on, I would also be able to work on that and show that Arrow's impossibility theorem can be proved much more simply in some ways, using only elementary mathematics. But at the same time, I was concerned about how to overcome that problem. And basically what I came round to in the context of welfare economics is that you have to bring in what economists call interpersonal comparison of welfare. For example, if you want to give priority to the interest of the worst off person, say the poorest person, then you have to compare people's lives, saying this person is better off than another. That is not a part of the Condorcet framework, nor of the Arrow framework. So then I had to develop, and they were mainly mathematical results in those days, as to how you can bring in interpersonal comparison in a systematic way for welfare economics. So that was one part of the subject. And then there were other things that I tried to do in welfare economics. And in some ways I got very stuck with that in the rest of my life. And social choice theory is the subject, I think, where I would claim to be my primary subject of work in all that period.
Kenneth Arrow addresses the problem of the redistribution of economic resources in a society by searching a social welfare function that can determine an order of preferences of individuals. His conclusion is that, in the case of more than two alternatives, it is not possible to apply the method of a choice of majority in a rational way. Suppose that three individuals, Mark, Luke and John, are asked in what order they would choose actions to balance the figures in public spending among three options: cut services, raise taxes, boost production. The order of Mark's preferences is as follows: cut services, raise taxes, and then boost production. Luke instead gives top priority to raising taxes, then boosting production, and then cutting services. John has another order of preferences. The first choice is to boost production, then cut services, and then raise taxes. Each of the three options has therefore become a favorite from the rest, once placed in second place and once in last place. The paradox of the so-called cyclical majorities comes into play, which, according to Arrow, is unsolvable, maintaining the fundamental rules of freedom and individual sovereignty. Instead, if the number of choices were only two, there would be no paradox, and the method of decision by majority could be applied. For Sen, however, when it comes to issues of the allocation and redistribution of resources, the rule of majority voting is, however, inadequate because other information must also be taken into account. Take the example of a cake that is worth 100. Mark has 98. Luke and John have 1 and 1 respectively. The decision of the majority, that is, 2 out of 3 people, will be to take something away from Mark and redistribute the resources. Mark's quote will drop to 96, and those of Luke and John will rise to 2. Now consider the case in which Mark has 4, while Luke and John each have 48. Luke and John are in the majority, therefore they decide based on their benefit to increase their share to 49 each, and leaving Mark with only 2. In terms of Arrow's theory, which only takes into account the choice of the majority, the two situations are identical. According to Sen, they are very different for the individuals involved, considering their initial condition and the one after the choice. Mark, who is in the minority in both cases, becomes just slightly less rich in the first situation, while in the second, in which he was already poor, he becomes considerably poorer. Sen concludes that, in order to arrive at an equitable social choice in the allocation and redistribution of resources, individual preferences cannot be taken into account, but more complex structures must be used. More information should be introduced, and the need to operate with interpersonal comparisons of well-being, because there is a difference, of which one cannot take into account, between preferring to be even more rich and that of not falling into poverty.
So that deals with the welfare economic side. There is, of course, also a voting side, which is the political aggregation problem. Well, the aggregation problem in the context of welfare economics is somewhat different from the aggregation problem when it comes to elections, referendums, and democracy. For this reason, that interpersonal comparisons are obvious things to use when it comes to judging welfare economic assessment, namely, is Italy better off today than it was last year? In what way can it be made better off, and so on. On the other hand, there you have to look at, in that particular context, you have to look at how the lives are, say, poorest people going compared with the richer people. You have to look at inequality. That's definitely an interpersonal comparison question. In the context of politics and democracy, you can't do it. One person, one vote. And therefore that paradox, Arrow's paradox, raises a different type of question in the context of democracy. And in fact, many people, when the Arrow's book in 1951 came out, took the Arrow theorem to be a demonstration that democracy cannot ever work. But it was nothing of that kind, of course. What it indicated is that certain principles of voting, like majority rule, indeed all principles of voting, will have some kind of contradiction. So then you have to see how could you avoid it. And there are two ways of avoiding it. One is that if people's preferences had some connection with each other, it may turn out that the even majority voting leads to consistent results. So some of my work was concerned with that political theory. In fact, what are the conditions where majority decisions are consistent? And then indeed, not only what are the sufficient conditions, as mathematicians say, but what are the necessary conditions. So I did a paper jointly with a student of mine, Prashanta Patnaik, on the necessary and sufficient conditions for consistent majority decision. So that's one way of looking at it. There is another approach which is Condorcet's own and pursued particularly by James Buchanan and public choice theorists of his kind, is that yes, majority rule may lead to contradictions, but people understand that this is a contradiction. And they sit together and they chat. And then they agree, saying, okay, I'll give up this, provided you go give up that. So it's a question of trade-off, as to say. And the trade-offs come often in a kind of intelligent form. So then democracy becomes, like politics, the art of the possible. And any democracy, of course, involves such give and take. You can't have a democracy without give and take. And that's why the idea, the modern idea of democracy, which has been pursued by political theorists like John Rawls, like Jürgen Habermas, and others, namely, you have to see democracy as public reasoning, becomes very important. And my own work on the theory of justice, I have a book called The Idea of Justice, that is concerned very much with democracy and with public reasoning. So on one side, I'm concerned with the welfare economic question about inequality, about poverty, how to judge them, because these are the subject matter of democratic preferences, democratic votes, and democratic decisions. On the other hand, there is also a question of how we react to each other's thing. Okay, this is the minority point of view, but we tolerate the minorities on condition that the minorities would also tolerate certain things that the majority wants to happen. So these are matters of dialogue. I can't think of democracy without a dialogue. And I think the first person, again, to emphasize that was Marquis de Condorcet in France. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough dialogue in it. They were very intolerant of each other, as you know. After the French Revolution, Condorcet's ideas had influenced the French Revolution. But once the revolution happened, there were very many people who were being persecuted because they didn't agree with the mainstream, Robespierre, whoever it is, who is running it. And it looked as if that some people were about to kill Condorcet when he actually killed himself. So what he was advocating, a kind of moderation, listening to each other, conversations with each other. He has left a great idea for us to pursue, but he didn't benefit from it because people in the reign of terror, they were not willing to chat with each other, and they would have definitely killed him if he had not killed himself. So that's a tragic end of his life. At the same time, it's an enormously gigantic, momentous beginning for an engagement in democracy, namely, what can you do by seeing democracy as public reasoning? Well, interpersonal comparison between different human beings is very central to the theory of justice, because the theory of justice is about a society, how things are going. There's a great Sanskrit distinction which Sanskrit legal theorists were keen on in terms of using two different words. And that distinction is between the idea of niti, as how good the institutions are, how just are the institutions, and nyaya, namely how good are the overall society, taking into account the institutions, but also how people's lives are going. Now, the Sanskrit theorists, going back more than 2,000 years, emphasize that distinction. And one good way of understanding it would be the often repeated statement of the so-called Holy Roman Emperor that let justice be done, even if the world perishes. That could be a principle in niti, the institutions are right. But if the world perishes, it's a pretty bad world, and it cannot be nyaya. Nyaya has to look at what's happening to people's lives. Now, I think the interpersonal comparison there requires you to look at people's well-being, but also their freedom. How much freedom do they have to lead one kind of life rather than others? It's a human-centric view, and human beings come in terms of their welfare, in terms of their freedom, and if you want to expand the ideas, in terms of their rights. And that is part of a theory of nyaya. Now, when I presented my book, The Idea of Justice, which draws a lot on social choice theory, it is actually an elaboration of the idea of nyaya, though I explain why I don't accept a niti-based, institution-based theory. I've learned a great deal from John Rawls, his theory of justice. I regard myself in many ways as a disciple of him, but where I disagree with him is that he ended up with the idea of just institution being adequate. But the justice of an institution, in my judgment, can be assessed only by seeing what it does to human lives, human beings, how do they fare in this. Nyaya is what I want. And given that, you have to look at many things about not how the institutions could be made ideal, but how you could see how differently things are going. For example, there's a famous argument in the Mahabharata, an Indian epic. It's a part of it which is called Gita, which is a kind of Hindu text, and which I'm going to be heretical now, where Krishna, who is really an incarnation of God, in arguing against Arjuna. Arjuna is a great hero of the epic. And they have assembled, this is just before the war begins. And Arjuna says, I know that we are on the right side, but in this war, so many people would die. Could this be the right thing? And Krishna said, oh, it must be, because it's your duty to do the right thing, no matter what happens. Arjuna is not convinced. Ultimately, he is convinced. Mainly, which is why it becomes a Hindu document, because Krishna is the incarnation of God, and he is telling people that you have to do your duty no matter what happens. Arjuna is resisting that. Now, in the context of my theory of justice, my idea of justice as I present it, I take more Arjuna's side. You have to see not whether people are doing their duty, but how people's lives are going. That's the central issue. And that applies whether, I, for example, happen to take view that many things in the European economic policies today have gone very badly wrong. It's not because as institutions they were wrong, I could see some reasoning for them, but the lives of people have gone very badly wrong unnecessarily. And therefore it's a critique based on Naya, where I would apply economic reasoning that it need not have gone so badly wrong. But ultimately, the philosophy and ethics that come into it is to judge the justice of a society in terms of what kind of lives human beings succeed in leading in that society.
When may a company define itself as just? This is the fundamental problem American philosopher John Rawls thinks liberal thought should confront. However, it is a problem that cannot be addressed adequately if it begins with an already preconceived idea of the common good, as utilitarianism does when it states that a good is the utility of individuals, because then all that maximizes the well-being of individuals is considered to be just, even when it comes to violating fundamental freedoms. In his 1971 book, A Theory of Justice, which has revolutionized the debate on this issue, Rawls' intention is to begin with the concept of justice, not that of common good, and proposes the idea of justice as fairness. This idea is based on two principles. The first is that every individual should be able to enjoy maximum freedom, compatible with the freedom of others. The second is that every person should be guaranteed equal opportunities. Rawls utilizes the theoretical tool of the social contract, which has a long tradition in Western political philosophy. Assume an imaginary situation, which Rawls calls the original position, where individuals who are called upon to establish the principles of justice are not now aware what their place in society will be, if they are, for example, healthy or sick, rich or poor. If they knew from the outset that they will be among the wealthy, some of the individuals would, for example, speak out against public health care. If they knew they were to be among the poorest, some would likely be in favor of it. On the other hand, under what Rawls calls the veil of ignorance, individuals will choose a system through which the least advantaged can obtain the maximum possible, hence based on a redistribution of resources. A just society is not one in which there are no inequalities, but one in which undeserved inequalities, those that are linked to the lottery of life, are reduced as much as possible, thanks to the redistribution of resources.
Well, examples to give in the distinction between Naya and Niti can be drawn from all kinds of areas, in economics, in politics, in sociology, and so on. Let me draw an economic thing. For example, the present economic crisis, which actually began in 2008 as a crisis of market capitalism. It generated a gigantic crisis, and certainly the loosening of control over the market economy had played a big part. Gradually, from the time of President Reagan onwards in the United States, the regulations that govern the market had been weakened and weakened and weakened. But by the time the 2008 crisis came, many of the financial institutions have had no restraint in responsibility at all. They were in a kind of situation that, in fact, Adam Smith had discussed in The Wealth of Nations when he was talking about the South Sea bubbles, and he mentioned the fact that that is the time when there was a government control needed. Smith is often taken as a great guru of the market economy, but here he is saying why the market unrestrained can go wrong. unless you also have sensible government policies. And what he talked about, some people who were ready to take gigantic amount of risk were borrowing money at a very high interest rate, cutting everybody else out. And then when they came to a collapse, since their expectation didn't come true, the whole economy collapsed because money had been drawn away from all other fruitful fields into speculation. Now, oddly enough, I mean, Smith's book was written in 1776, published in 1776. But in 2008, we were in a rather similar situation, when a lot of money had gone into financial capital, various kinds of derivatives and hedge funds. There was a fair amount of Chinese money also coming in out of their surpluses, which they wanted to leave in the global economy. So money was very cheap, and that was being used to produce a world which was very volatile. And then on top of that, attempt to generate some profits by lending money from by the banks in particular for supporting buildings where the values of the building are less than the value of the loan. All these ultimately produced a terrible result. So this is crisis of the market economy. But the way it went, it's affected the lives of people. In order to save it, the American government, but also to some extent European government, bailed out the banks and the financial institutions. There were a lot of problems in governance anyway, including in Europe. But on top of that, this gigantic bailout produced huge deficits in America as well as in Europe. Then it looked what you have to do is to cut the state. And cutting the state involved often cutting welfare programs. America doesn't have a national health service. Obama's little attempt at having this was opposed strongly because it takes state money. Similarly, you were cutting in Europe, part of the Eurozone, but also independently in Britain. They were cutting a lot of the welfare state. Now, there was a distinction to be made. Quite a lot of the arrangements in the welfare state are things that require reform, certainly. But that was not what had generated the crisis. Even Greece in 2008 was having a 4% growth rate. Since then, they have been having down and down and down, so much so that there are more than 20% less GDP today than there were before all these restrictive programs began. So here the institutions, which looked sensible, you have deficit, you cut deficit, ended up being wrong because it did not produce either stable institutions in the long run, nor did it produce better lives of people. In terms of Naya, it was a big mistake. And in the long run, it's a mistake for NITI too, because you couldn't have that kind of viability. It's like the euro, which sounds like a very good idea. But if you eliminate all the institutions connected with monetary policy, when you don't have a fiscal union or a political union, you don't have any adjustability for economies like Spain or Portugal, Greece, or even Italy. And you are in a situation where you're in a box. Now, they've got into a box in thinking in purely institutional terms. So NITI, quite aside from being not a good guide, is not a very good guide to a good society. It's not even a good way to think about how to proceed, because constantly you have to think about how the lives of people would be affected. And the Ventotene Declaration of 41 and the Milan Declaration of 43, they wanted a European Union, but they wanted a political union first. What we have instead, a currency union, which was unviable because of the inflexibility, because you need the exchange rate adjustment to make Greece competitive even Italy more competitive, Spain and Portugal. And instead of that, they have got more and more cuts. Every time they cut, because of Keynesian reason, the economy goes down some more. Somebody's expenditure, everybody's expenditure, as Keynes said, is somebody's income. So when you go downward spiral, it's a terrible situation. Now, we are stuck in a situation where the institutional format has gone wrong. But this can be judged not only by how badly human lives are going, how miserable the lives of people are in south of Europe as a result, unnecessarily so, because I believe it's really bad economics that has landed this place there. And here I invoke Smith again. As he mentioned, it's very important to look at the way the institutions function. When he supports market, he pointed out, why do we need a good political economy? He said there are two answers to that. One, good political economy makes people more affluent, richer, so they are able to spend their money in a way they would like to. And second, a good economy makes the states richer, so the states can carry out their duties in providing public services. So this particular Smithian advice was comprehensively overlooked by a lot of people who claimed to be disciples of Smith. And instead they went on going straight at public expenditure as quickly as possible in order to rescue these economies were going down and down and down. So I think we have ended up in a situation which we could have avoided by clear-headed thinking, both on the ethics of economics as well as the science of economics. And by comprehensively ignoring them, I think we have ended up in a mess which was not really needed at all. I've always been keen on economists being influenced by philosophical thinking, because it seemed to me that it's very important for economists to bear in mind the role of philosophy in making us understand how human beings act. And that's the subject matter of the theory of rationality, and also on how human beings have reason to act, and that also influences how we actually do act. Not quite the same thing, but they're influenced. Unfortunately, the philosopher who had the greatest influence among economists happened to be Jeremy Bentham. And he had a very simple theory of good and bad. Good is utility, just happiness and nothing else. And good for society is the sum total of happiness. But that is a very limited view. And we had to take an interest in things about what human beings like to do, what we want to do. We value our freedom. There are many things we can do which are important for our freedom, which may or may not improve our happiness. We don't know. I mean, we may become happy because we have succeeded in exercising freedom. But that is a kind of derivative happiness. If you just seek happiness and nothing else, I think there's a kind of foundationlessness that we find in utilitarian economics, which is very unfortunate. Adam Smith actually did talk about that in the theory of moral sentiment. And he, to some extent, I think he's even criticizing his great friend, David Hume, accusing him a little being soft on the subjective, utility-based, mental-based, utility-based perspective. What are the reasoning behind what we want? And it's not just happiness, but the reason behind the happiness. just as you said, that we all like being praised, but it's important to ask what makes us praiseworthy, not just that we love praise. So I think that is a very important issue, because we are ultimately reasoning creatures. I think utilitarianism does a great injustice to human beings by assuming that human beings simply have feelings, reactions, like Pavlov's dog. It responds to stimulus. But we also think, and we may think, look, I'm doing fairly well, but this is a dreadful society. If I say that, there's nothing wrong, there's nothing incomprehensible. Someone who cannot comprehend how I could say that my own life is going well, but I don't think I want this kind of society. There's nothing ununderstandable about that. So economists, by taking their clue from utilitarianism, made, in my judgment, two rather bad false steps. One was in the theory of rationality, tended to assume that the maximization of self-interest must be the only way you can understand rationality. Or to put it another way, our reasoning, the height of our reasoning, is to find out what makes us individually well off. But that leaves out almost everything that people have argued about over the centuries, namely, what kind of a society do we want? What kind of relation with what each other do we want? What duties do we have? What rights would we like to have? These are all matters that take us beyond making reasoning concentrated only on your narrow self-interest. The second mistake it made is that by judging society in terms of how happy people are, quote unquote, no matter what causes happiness, they already made a big diversion from a reason-based evaluation. John Stuart Mill, though himself a utilitarian, saw the problem, particularly in the context of liberty. He pointed out in his book on liberty that suppressing someone's freedom in his personal life, not allowing the person, say, freedom of worship of his or her own religion, an example that he used, may make us very happy, so that happiness may outweigh the suffering of the person who is not allowed to have the liberty. But there is no parity, as John Stuart Mill put it, between a person's happiness from his own life going in the direction in which he would like it to go, and other people's happiness in suppressing persons from doing that. That's a big mistake. So Mill noticed that, and we have to take that into account in our theory of justice, so liberty becomes very important. But we also have to see that sometimes people's lives may go very badly, but they can still generate a little happiness in their lives. If you are very, very deprived and have no hope of salvation, no hope of a better life, you know, you are a hard-working domestic servant who doesn't get a single day off, working for 18 hours a day, you may get a tremendous amount of happiness when you get a few days off, because you've cut your expectation down. But that's a terrible way of saying, therefore, this person is the happiest man alive, because he's so happy, because he's taking pleasure in small mercies, and we shouldn't make that important. Similarly, when women live in a very sexist, oppressive society, when there are very strong class distinction, and unemployed people or people working at very low wages get great joy from a little relief from that, that's not what we have to look at only. The criteria of utility, the very malleable, very corruptible criteria. We have to see what are the person have a reason to want, and if free, if his spirit had not been broken down as badly as it may be by an oppressive society, what would she or he want? And if you ask that question, then you are pursuing the idea of freedom as being the central feature of judging the advantages that human beings have, rather than pursuing the idea of utility and just the mental metric of pleasure and pain. The idea of freedom is a complicated one because it's based ultimately on reasoning. By freedom we mean whether we can get what we want and what we have reason to want. So reasoning is quite central to that. And freedom of reasoning, and generally freedom of thought, is therefore a very important part of freedom. And that's why many societies which generated a high living standard in terms of income, but did not give people the freedom to move around freely, freedom to think freely, independently, could not be said to have succeeded in doing what it ought to do, namely generate freedom for the people in the society. Now, I think in the context of economics, the idea that some of us have tried to pursue, and I had a particular role in pursuing that, is the idea of capability. At one level, it's an Aristotelian idea, when he is concerned about what people are able to do, what makes their life go well. He talked about functioning of people, and functioning means not just being able to buy goods, but being well nourished, being able to read and write, to be able to talk with others, to be able to move around, to be able to have a public life and participate in public life. All these things are important. Of course, Aristotle himself emphasized mostly the freedom of thought and mind, and he thought the best life is that of a philosopher, which is good since he was a philosopher himself. But if you take a clue from that, you can get a general approach. And Adam Smith did a lot to develop the idea. So did Karl Marx, and so did John Stuart Mill, the idea of how many different dimensions freedom has. And we have to see the role of reasoning, and we have to see how our lives are going as we understand in terms of our reasoning. Are we hungry? Are we well nourished? Are we well clothed in a way we would like? Are we well sheltered? Or are we defenseless from cold and inclement weather? A big issue it becomes with global warming. Whether we are in a position to participate in public discussion. Adam Smith talked a lot about people's freedom to appear in public without shame. He said that in a rich country, the minimum income you need to avoid poverty has to be higher, because in order to be able to appear in public shame, you have to have the clothing and the other amenities which people in that society, a richer society, has. For example, in New York, if you did not have an income enough to have a television, a child may feel very deprived in school because others can talk about what they saw on the box. But in Kenya, this may not be a problem. But it's the same thing we are looking at, as Smith pointed out. He didn't use this example, he used mostly clothing, but I'm just adapting his example. Namely, that in Kenya, when school children want to talk with each other, or when people want to communicate with each other and appear in public, they need less of an income to do it than people would need in New York to do it. And this also explains why the pressure of this kind of conformism, having television, having various equipment, can may sometimes cut into expenditure on what we may think otherwise to be very basic necessity, like nutrition. People are often surprised how come there is so much undernourishment in America. One of the reasons is that money is often deprived in order to get those things which allow people to appear in public without shame. That gets a kind of priority for school kids, adult people. You have to have the right kind of clothing, right kind of amenities at home. So that whole approach of capability connected with our reasoning and the nature of the society, drawing on ideas of Aristotle, of Smith, of Mill, of Marx, it produces an understanding of freedom, which is, I think, very rich, and which economics can certainly accommodate. When we talk about interpersonal comparisons of well-being, it need not be just a comparison of their happiness. It could be their actual freedoms. If you are in a society when some people have very little freedom, either because they're very poor or because they're suppressed, they're not allowed to speak freely, they're arrested if they speak freely, then they are not well off in a way that they could have been if they had these freedoms. So I think the subject of welfare economics have to be alive to the demands of freedom, including the demands of liberty, as well as issues about inequality of incomes, inequality of opportunities, and everything else.
The capabilities approach is one of the most influential paradigms of the global debate on human development. What it suggests is a theory capable of regulating the distribution of costs and benefits of social life, beginning with an assessment of the actual well-being of people that cannot be measured only in terms of income. When one speaks of equality, then, what must be equal? Equality of what is the title of a 1979 essay by Sen. It is the capabilities of people to do or not do something, to be or not be someone, which is equivalent to the freedom of individuals to act and define themselves. According to this approach, the degree of justice in a society is measured on the fact that it is capable of guaranteeing all people a number of fundamental human operations, hence an adequate quality of life, a well-being, which means a welfare but in the broad sense and not just material. The American philosopher Martha Nussbaum has taken this theory and expanded it from the comparative assessment plan of the levels of well-being to normative and political discourse. For Nussbaum, there are 10 basic capabilities that are equal for all human beings in any place and time. Life, bodily health, bodily integrity, senses, imagination, thought, emotions, practical reason, affiliation, other species, play, control over one's environment. The list is the result of extensive multicultural discussions and represents a description of the human being towards which thoughts, religions, and different value systems come together. The capabilities approach thus contains a reference to the moral idea of the dignity of the human being. This is the calling that must be addressed to public policies and governments, for people have a right to expect these conditions of life in order to allow for the full development of one's humanity.
It's very important in terms of economic reasoning to understand that in order to solve any major economic problem that required resources, you have to be friendly to economic growth. And Europe has been very, very short-sighted on that subject. It seems to me that there are two problems that Europe had overlooked. One is that you need economic growth in order to pay back debt. Economic growth generates economic resources, and that can be used for anything. Supporting public services, as Adam Smith emphasized in The Wealth of Nations, but also to paying back debt. But if you don't have economic growth and you're going down and down, you won't get there. After all, people admire Sweden paying back its debt in the 90s, but they did it in a period of economic growth. The American debt went way down during Bill Clinton's time, but that was because of economic growth. The gigantic wartime debts disappeared in a few years of economic growth after the war. Now, Europe has gone in a completely wrong direction here. One morning last June, I had two phone calls. One was from a reporter in France telling me that the first quarter of 2012, Eurozone has had zero economic growth rather than falling. This is a matter of congratulation. And would I join in the celebration of zero economic growth? About an hour and a half later, I had a phone call from a television station in New Delhi, NDTV, asking me, there are dismal economic news about Indian growth rate, which has come down, and how shall we deal with the dismal economic situation? So I asked, how dismal is the situation? What is the growth rate in India? So she said, it is 6.5% per year. I said, you know, Europeans would be very happy to get that. I think India made a lot of mistakes, but on this subject, Indians have been right. That is, they have been concerned with economic growth, that if India does not have an economic crisis or a debt-based one, not because India doesn't have a debt, but it's a lot of debt, but people don't take such a pessimistic view about what it can pay, given the fact that its growth rate is so high. It could be higher than 6.5%. So the NDTV interviewer was right. How can we raise the growth rate? Why not 9%? India had for 2 years 9% just a few years ago, and recently too, 8.5% last year. So that's a concern, and Europe really didn't get that point, I think. The second thing is that there are a lot of reforms that are needed in Europe. I think it needs reform about retirement age. It needs reform about working week. It needs a reform on many types of entitlements. But one has to distinguish between economic reform and, on one side, and austerity on the other. The trouble is that Europe tried to do the two together. So a lot of people who wanted economic reform, whether in Italy or in Greece, found that they had a joint basket. Economic reform plus huge cuts in public services. Well, they were opposed to that. Public services, as I mentioned from Adam Smith onwards, has been a big thing in Europe. And indeed, after the Second World War, the big consensus in Europe to emerge is that essential public services, healthcare, social safety nets, etc., are very important. And you shouldn't cut it, not just for Keynesian reason, which many economists rightly, like Paul Krugman has emphasized, but that's not the only reason. There's also, these are very big commitments of Europe. You can't get tremendous amount of support of people without doing something. So as a result, a lot of people, I know a lot of Whig voters I know, were against these reform package because it's a package. They wanted the reform. They thought the lack of accountability was a terrible problem in Greece. The retirement age was a terrible problem. But combined with cutting every service, public service, indiscriminately, they were not going to vote for it. So there was a gigantic confusion there between need for reform and need for austerity. Europe needed reform badly. It did not need austerity at that time. And what would have been the really enlightened policy is to make the distinction, demand the reform, and at the same time not go for austerity, try to generate economic growth, which it could have, but for the austerity, in order that the need for austerity could have gone away, in order to be able to finance the public services, even as you are reforming. Now, many times, that's not the direction in which it's gone. That distinction between reform and austerity is important, and the significance and the crucial role of economic growth is important. Both these respects, I think Europe, in my judgment, made a mistake, which is sad because the world had learned so much from Europe in every way. I think it's important to contrast the achievements and failures of China and India as two high-growth economies. Indians keep complaining that their growth rate has come down, so do the Chinese, but they're still number one and number two among the large economies in the world. China a little ahead of India. But the big difference between China and India isn't that. There are two differences, one in favor of China and one in favor of India. The distinction that is in favor of China is that the Chinese have made much greater use of the resources generated by economic growth to improve the living standard of people, spend more money in public health care. India spent about 1.5%, China spent about 2.5%. Spending more money in public services, China spent about twice on power sector than India does. All kinds of ways the living standard-based connections, health, education, social and physical infrastructure, including power, water, the Chinese have done better than the Indians have. Better use of the resources generated by economic growth. Where I think the Chinese are less easy position is their continuation of the one-party state. Chinese emphasize democracy, and that's not completely a hollow claim. There is much more public discussion in China today than was possible earlier. It's certainly true. When I studied the Chinese famine that took place before the economic reform, this is the period when all newspapers completely shut out the information about the famine. So every district thought it had famine, but thought that all other districts are doing very well. It actually deceived the Chinese government too, because the Chinese government sitting in Beijing looked at all the numbers that came from the districts, and the districts could not admit that they are failing because they heard that everybody else is succeeding. So they all concocted numbers. So when the Chinese government put the numbers together, they thought they had 100 million more metric tons of rice than they actually had. So they continued that inane policy for 2 years in which 30 million people died, largest famine in recorded history. Now, Chinese are not like that now. There's much more public discussion. And yet there's censorship. And yet people may get into real difficulty for criticizing the government. And certainly elections are not on the basis of multi-party freedom, free campaigning and election. And connected with it is the human right thing. Now, China has done so much for human rights in the very basic sense of making people well-fed, well-clothed, non-hungry, getting medically treated. China should not have difficulty in facing the world on its human rights record. But because of intolerance, when a particular, say, the Nobel Peace Prize goes to someone, they have to protest, which is, I feel very sad. I'm very sympathetic for China because it's one of the countries from which the world can learn so much, and India in particular can learn so much. But there is this small problem that they have to address somehow. On the other hand, in the case of India, that's never a question. Everyone criticizes the government, in fact, sometimes even more than they deserve to criticize. So, and Indians like democracy. Indians like free public radio, public television, the more than 300 stations on television giving you the news all the time, different points of view, some of them round the clock, and different editorials. And people actually enjoy it, quite aside from that fact that it helps democratic governance. So I think we have to look at the world with a critical eye. They all have done some great good. From Europe we can learn what it does with the welfare state and the National Health Service. What America did was how to maintain high levels of employment and high growth rate in innovation. How China converted their economic growth into living standard development. How India went for democracy after 200 years of colonial rule, made an immediate success of democracy. But there are other things that India has to learn from China, from Europe, from America. So I think I'm happy that we live in a world in which all the virtues and all the knowledge is not concentrated in one part of the world. We have, all of us, something to learn from others and something not to learn from others. And in an odd kind of way, since I like argument, reasoning, and in particular, to come back to Marquis de Condorcet, public reasoning, I am happy with a world in which there's so much to learn from each other, within the border as well as across the border between nations.